Well, I'm going to introduce Sheldon Russell. Mr. Russell told me that he had spoken to this group a few years ago, and I assured him that Reverend Carol and I had cleaned it up. He said that you guys were pretty rowdy. So I understand that he has been a public school teacher in his past career, and he is Professor Emeritus at the University of Central Oklahoma. He has, in November, published the 5th book in his career, and we are happy to have him here this afternoon. Please welcome Sheldon Russell.
When I retired, I moved back to the farm where I grew up, out there in those hills between Freedom and Winoka. And I write my books out there in the old oil house that I restored. So I haven't seen this many people in a year. So if I panic, you know why. I'm considerably older than I was too the last time we met. I was sitting in the living room watching TV. And I have a dog, his name is Chester. And my wife's in the kitchen, and I said, I suddenly realized that I hadn't seen my dog. So I said, Nancy, have you seen Chester? And she said, no. I said, did you put him outside? And she said, no. And she came back in about that time in the room, and she said, he's in your lap.
Oh my God.
My dog Chester looked up at me like I was an idiot because he knows his name. So that's where I am. So if I repeat myself, you forgive me. I grew up on that cattle ranch out there. Went to a one-room school, West Liberty, for the first grade. It was kind of a storytelling culture. All the neighbors get together, sit on the front porch and tell lies, and so I sort of grew up with storytelling. And then later, when I became a professor, I got interested in narrative psychology, and I've kind of discovered the importance of story and narrative in our lives, and so that's one of the reasons I think that I went into this area. It's how we define ourselves. And so I have great fun with it. It keeps me off the streets, pretty much. I've written, this is the 5th Hook Runyon mystery. I've written 10 books altogether, 11 if you count academic stuff. Started out writing historical fiction. And most of these books are set in this area. They always tell you should write what you know. And this is what I know, and these are the people that I know, and these are the men that I grew up with. My dad was a railroader in Winoka. I worked there for years. All my uncles, everybody I knew that had a job worked for the railroad. And my first book, we used to sit at the stop there in Winoka on the bus, trains that go through. You still have to wait there to this day. And we were sitting there one day, I must have been junior high or younger, and there was a switchman switching engines, switching cars, and he had his arm cut off at the elbow, no doubt from switching cars. It happened frequently. And that sort of stuck in my head, so my protagonist is a one-armed railroad bull by the name of Hook. He drinks busthead liquor and collects rare books. He lives in a caboose, which fits the mystery genre pretty well, because when I write a new book, I just put him on the caboose and move him into a new situation, a different place. The books are not written sequentially, but I do carry characters over from one to the other. And Larry McMurtry of Lonesome Dove fame said one time that the best plot that you can have is a journey, because you start in one place, you're going somewhere else, things happen along the way. So this fit the writing perfectly for me. I could put these people on a train and they can't get off. You can turn up the heat. You have a crucible. Your plot is built in right there. So that's basically how these books are put together. I think Murder on the Orient Express may be an example of that. Some of the characters that I have in this 5th book, this book, by the way, received a starred review in Publishers Weekly, which may not mean much to you, but it does to a writer, because they're really hard to come by. Even people who deserve them don't get them sometimes. So I'm really proud of that, if you'll excuse the bragging. One of the characters, other than Hook, I have a character, his name is Runt. And the reason his name is Runt is because he has real short legs. The reason they called him, I don't know if Farm, if you remember Farm, is the runt pig was always the smallest, and it was the one that got the hind tip, excuse the language. So Runt doesn't feel too bad about that. His mother named him Runt because she could have named him Hind Tip. I like to have contrast with my characters. So I usually bring one in from somewhere else, from the East Coast, from New York City, and I put them with Hook. And in this book, I bring Rhea in from New York, and she's just involved with the sort of new forensic psychology. So she's interested in why people do what they do, and Hook is interested in what they do. He wants to catch them, and she wants to understand them. And so they have another character I have in this book. His name is Banjo. Railroaders always had nicknames for everybody. I don't know if you're aware of that or not. And the reason they call him Banjo, because he has a big nose and he can play his nose and make it sound just like a claw hammer banjo. And Hook, he's an operator in one of the roundhouses. Hook goes in one day and Banjo has a balloon stuck in his nose. He says, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Well, I'm making my nose sound just like a bagpipe." And he says, "Well, how's it work?" He says, "Not too well. It keeps blowing my dentures out." So you can see that these are intelligent books that I write. They have lots of lessons to be learned. My wife's an artist, a sculptor. In fact, she's done some sculpture here in town. The lady down at Runnymede Hotel is hers. And we bought an old building. It was built in 1893 in Guthrie. It was down there by the depot, and it was about 100 yards from the railroad tracks. And we restored it and built a Victorian apartment upstairs and moved in. And my office was upstairs. And we forgot that trains come down the track about every 15 minutes. And they would sound like they were going to come right through our living room. We were that close. And about that same time, there was a serial killer. It was called the railway killer. And he was killed. He'd hop a freight train, and it just, you never know where he's going to get off. It's just random kinds of killings. He'd get off and kill somebody within sight. It was always within sight of the railroad tracks. And get back on the train, and they couldn't catch this guy. They finally did. Caught him in Texas, so they executed him like the next weekend. Some of the killings were brutal. Let me give you just an example of what he did. He killed as many as 15 people, and he used rocks and blunt objects to do it. Do you even remember this? Railway
This part of
killer?
it's true.
This is true.
What's the year?
More or less.
What time frame?
Gosh, it'd been early 80s probably. Then he would go into their houses if it was available, and he'd take sentimental objects, take a look at their driver's license and things like that. An unidentified homeless woman was shot 4 times and dumped in an abandoned farmhouse. Michael White, a homosexual, was bludgeoned to death with a brick. An unidentified transient was beaten to death with a piece of plywood. A 21-year-old student was bludgeoned to death with a 52-pound rock. I've got a whole list, I won't go through them all. 26-year-old teacher was killed with a pickaxe. An 80-year-old woman was shot in the head with a shotgun. We were living there, and this was on the news every night. And those trains would come through 3 o'clock in the morning, and they would stop at that crossing. And I'd lay there in bed and wonder if this guy was getting off the train or not. And so, somewhere along the line, I put that in my head. And that's basically what this book is about. It's not a brutal book, but the idea was there, the serial killer. This is the guy here. And they caught him, his sister finally gave him away. She lived in Old Mexico, and he was taking this stuff home to her. And she finally got wise and turned him in, and that's when they caught him in Texas. And he claimed that he was half angel and he couldn't die, but he did. Let me read you the prologue. This is, every mystery has to have a murder, right? So I start this book with the murder, the short prologue. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Benjamin Way tossed the last stick of wood onto the dying fire. Smoke twisted up through the bridge timbers and disappeared into the blackness. He had failed to find enough firewood to see him through the night, the jungle having been picked clean by the generations of hobos before him. Little remained but empty tin cans and broken whiskey bottles and the stench of moldy bedding. Carved into the wood timbers were images and words left by those before him. Messages from the past, odd patterns of circles and triangles and squares, random numbers, distorted faces, primitive and misshapen animals. Hobos left messages, usually some sort of an image. Don't go to this house, the preacher lives there, or the sheriff, or you won't get any food here, or this one's an easy mark. If only he knew what the symbols meant. Perhaps in them were messages of welcome or of warning. He leaned in closer to hear what the hieroglyphs had to say, but they were silent. Heaving a sigh, he took out his case double-X pocket knife and began to strip away the casing from a stick of salami. He cut the meat into thin slices on a can lid, careful not to exhaust his meager food supply. Before partaking of his night meal, he put away what sausage remained, cleaned the knife blade on his pant cuff, and dropped it back into his pocket. He favored the pocket knife's bone handle above all else. He had mowed yards for months to pay for the knife, knowing all the while that this day would come, the day he would leave home and never return. Born against his will, he had a life thus far as bleak as his birth, an unwanted nuisance even for those who bore him. He did not know why this was so, no more than they. He knew only the mark was upon him. They had broken his soul with indifference and driven him to the fringes of society, and in the end, walking away had been the only option that remained. As the last hurrah, the fire took hold, its heat rose and stung his face. At his back, the evening chill settled over his shoulders like a shroud. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle sounded, corporeal and lusty, and a shiver passed down his spine. Fear or excitement he could no longer tell. any more than he could identify the feeling twisting in his belly. Even in a flash of foreboding, he held no regrets. Beyond this place, beyond this night, he no longer mattered, forgotten as surely as yesterday's lunch. Overhead, the timbers creaked, and he drew his legs up and wrapped his arm around his knees. A breeze swept in, and the grass whispered at his back. Smoke climbed from the fire and worked at the edges of his eyes. From somewhere high above the bridge, an owl hooted, signaling danger to its kind and causing the hairs on his arms to rise. He clenched his teeth with resolve. Tomorrow, when the sun rose, things would be better. Tomorrow, he would remember all the reasons why he had left. Tomorrow, he would know that his decision had been right. The fire sputtered and paled at his feet. His shadow danced at the edges of his camp. He rubbed away the tears. He was but a boy, of no consequence, a speck in the universe. Who knew what evils awaited beyond the firelight? An ember crackled and sparks rode the wind upward into the blackness. The circle of light closed in and the gloom tightened about him. Something snapped from beyond the bridge pilings. A twig, or maybe the contraction of the rails. His mouth went dry and his throat tightened, and the embers struggled against the darkness and then faded. If only he had gathered more wood. If only daylight would break. If only he still slept in his bed, someone familiar in the kitchen. That's not quite all of it, but I'm running out of time. So that's the murder. And I put Hook back as a hobo. He's an ex-hobo. He knew all about the jungles and all that stuff. So he's defenseless in this book. Any questions?
Have you ever been approached by any movie company wanting to make a movie out of any of your books?
Yes. What I discovered, I had assigned a producer for a while, or an agent who sold to producers, is that Hollywood does a lot of talking and very little action. It's so expensive to make this stuff that your odds are really pretty small. But it was exciting anyway to get that attention. I have another one interested, but I'm not banking on it.
What did you teach mainly at OC? Creative writing or something?
No, I didn't. I was a reading specialist. I worked with
okay.
graduate students.
Okay.
I have one degree in English from Northwestern.
I got you.
Maria Author is my mentor.
How long does it take you to write a book like that?
1 year if the world leaves me alone, which is usually more like 18 months. And then another year to get them published. But there's lots of rewriting involved, back and forth.
Have you ever considered any nonfiction material?
You know, I have. I'm 75, and I would be about 85 at the time I got one nonfiction. I'd have 2 or 3 dogs on my lap.
On your rewriting thing, are these things that you choose to do or somebody recommends to you or what? You said you addressed rewriting a while ago.
I rewrite. Writing is all about rewriting. You write through your first draft. I don't worry too much about the mistakes. You just write it. And then you go back and you make it good, or you make it as good as you can. And then I like to let them cool off. I can have 3 months. You pick it up and read it, and it's like reading someone else's writing, and you see all the mistakes, or you see most of them. And then the editor, you do them at least twice. You go through it with the editor, and then when they print it, first thing you do is find a mistake on page 2. And by the way, a half dozen readers pointing it out. Anything else?
Do you happen to have a first edition copy of The Big Sleep?
No, I don't. Do you?
No, I don't.
I was going to say we could take a vacation. Anything else? Thank you for inviting me, it was fun.
Thank you very much.
If you want one, I'll put a $1 million signature on it.